I was always treated like the family disappointment, while my sister got everything she ever wanted. Now that she's broke and jobless, my parents expect me to save her, but I gave them a reality check instead. You know that feeling when no matter how hard you try, nothing is ever good enough? Well, that was me, the family disappointment. Growing up, it always felt like I could never win in my parents' eyes. No matter what I achieved, it was never enough to compare to the golden child, my sister. She got everything she ever wanted, all the praise, all the attention. Meanwhile, I was the one constantly overlooked, criticized, and reminded of how I didn't measure up. But that's not the end of the story. It turns out the tables can turn in the most unexpected ways. Fast forward to now, and my sister's life isn't quite as perfect as it once seemed. After a series of bad decisions, she's found herself broke, jobless, and with nowhere to turn. And guess who my parents expect to come to her rescue? You guessed it, me. The same person they always ignored and made feel inferior. But this time, things were different. I wasn't that same person anymore, the one who would drop everything to fix her problems. I'll admit, when they first came to me with the request, I was hit with this strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I felt like I owed it to her to help out, but on the other, I couldn't forget how I was treated all those years. So, I decided to do something unexpected. Instead of rushing in to save the day, I gave them a reality check. And trust me, the look on their faces was priceless. But what I said next might shock you. Stay tuned to find out how I handled it and whether or not my parents finally understood how I felt all these years. You won't believe what happened next. Growing up, it was always clear who my parents' favorite was. My sister, let's call her Sarah, could do no wrong. She was the one who got the new clothes, the latest gadgets, the trips to expensive places. I remember being a teenager, watching her get all these things, while I was lucky if I got a second-hand book or a hand-me-down sweater. Every single accomplishment I had, whether it was acing a test or getting a part-time job, was dismissed with the same old line, "Why can't you be more like Sarah?" It stung every single time. It wasn't that I hated her, she was my sister, after all. But it was impossible not to feel like I was invisible, always being compared to someone who had everything handed to her. As we grew older, things didn't really change. Sarah went to a top university, moved to a big city, and started her dream career right after graduation. Meanwhile, I was left trying to figure things out, taking jobs that barely paid the bills. But I wasn't upset about my path. In fact, I found my own way, making my own mistakes and learning along the way. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and I found contentment in that. But that didn't stop my parents from always nudging me toward what they thought I should be doing, always in Sarah's shadow, it seemed. Then came the blow. After several years of success, Sarah's life started falling apart. It wasn't immediate, but slowly, she made some really poor decisions that led to her downfall. She quit her high-paying job because she wasn't happy, spent all her savings on a failed business venture, and even got herself into a messy relationship that only made things worse. Now, she was completely broke, no job, and no real prospects for the future. And my parents, well, they suddenly decided it was my turn to be the hero. I'll admit, part of me felt guilty. I wanted to help her, after all, we were family. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how much I had been hurt by them all these years. They were suddenly looking at me, asking me to bail her out. But they had never cared when I was struggling. They never even noticed when I was dealing with my own hardships. No, it was always about Sarah. So when they called me, expecting me to save the day, I had a decision to make. Would I step in, despite everything, or would I finally stand up for myself? The answer, when I gave it, shocked them all. The call came on a Tuesday evening. My mom's voice was more urgent than usual, a little shaky as she explained Sarah's situation. "She's really struggling, sweetie. We've tried everything. You know she's always been a bit impulsive, but now, she has nothing left. No job, no savings, and she can barely pay her rent." The words felt rehearsed, like they'd been practicing this speech for a while. It hit me hard because, for the first time in years, they were asking me for something, for my help. The familiar knot tightened in my stomach, but this time, it wasn't from feeling sorry for Sarah. It was from the raw memory of every time I'd been overlooked. Every time my parents had sided with her, letting me deal with my struggles on my own. I had spent so many nights, in my room, thinking how different things would have been if they had cared half as much about me. Now, they expected me to be the savior, the one to fix everything. It felt like they were just passing the problem on to me, like I was the last option. I stayed quiet for a moment, letting the silence settle. "What exactly do you want me to do?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. They stumbled over their words, trying to make it sound like they weren't asking for much. They knew I wasn't the one who could just pull money out of thin air. But they still wanted me to at least try. Try to talk some sense into Sarah, to convince her to get a job, to help her move forward. I'd been patient up until that point, but then, something shifted. It was like a light bulb had gone off in my head. I realized this wasn't about helping my sister. This was about me finally setting boundaries. This was about making my parents see the consequences of years of favoritism. I had spent so much of my life trying to please them, never quite measuring up, always feeling like I was the backup plan. And now, when Sarah was in trouble, they expected me to drop everything to fix her. I can't just rescue her, Mom, I said, my voice firm, though my heart raced. I've been dealing with my own life, too, and I'm not going to be the one to fix this. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. My mom tried to argue, but it wasn't the usual pleading I was used to. There was something different in her tone this time. Maybe she could feel that I was finally standing my ground. But the tension only deepened as I held my ground, knowing that this conversation wasn't over. I wasn't done yet. What I didn't expect was the sudden flood of guilt that followed. Was I being too harsh? Was this just another moment where I was abandoning family, like I had been taught to do all my life? But then I thought about the years of being second best, always being reminded that I wasn't enough. No, this time, it wasn't about what I could do for Sarah or my parents. It was about me, finally speaking up for myself. And as I hung up the phone, I knew there would be consequences. But what I didn't know is how far my parents would go to make me cave. Would they push me to the breaking point, or would they finally understand what it felt like to be in my shoes all these years? The next few days were a blur of tension. My mom tried calling me several more times, but I kept my distance, letting the silence settle between us. Sarah, on the other hand, texted me once, asking if I could talk. But I couldn't bring myself to respond right away. Something inside me had shifted, and I knew that if I gave in now, I'd be taking another step toward becoming the person who always had to fix everyone else's messes. But the weight of the situation was hard to ignore. I could feel the pressure building. My parents called me almost every evening, telling me how bad things were getting with Sarah. She's really at rock bottom this time, my dad said one night, his voice tinged with desperation. She needs you. I could hear the unspoken plea in his tone. They were running out of options, and I was their last hope. I felt guilty, torn between wanting to be there for my sister and the raw anger bubbling up inside me. Wasn't I always the one left behind? The one who had to make it on my own? Now, they were treating me like some kind of safety net, someone they could rely on only when it suited them. It didn't sit right with me. That weekend, my parents came over to my apartment. They were calm at first, but I could see the worry in their eyes, the way they kept glancing at each other, almost as if they were bracing for the worst. We sat down in the living room, and my mom spoke first, her voice soft. Sweetie, we know this isn't easy. But we're asking you to be there for Sarah. Just give her a little help. Just a push in the right direction. My heart was pounding in my chest. I have given her a push, I replied. More than once. And look where it's gotten her. She's an adult now, and it's not my job to clean up her mess every time she messes up. My dad's face hardened, the disappointment already written across his features. You don't get it, do you? She's your sister. You should want to help. The words felt like a slap in the face. He wasn't seeing it. He wasn't hearing me. All these years, I had been trying to please them, to be the good daughter. And now they were acting like I owed them something. Like I owed Sarah something. I stood up, unable to stay seated any longer. The anger that had been simmering inside me for so long was starting to spill over. You want me to help her? Fine. But I'm not going to do it your way. I'm not going to be the one to rescue her every single time she makes a mistake. She needs to figure this out on her own. And if you can't understand that, then maybe it's time you started seeing things from my perspective. The room was silent. My parents exchanged a look, their disappointment obvious. It was the same look they'd given me all my life, the look that told me I wasn't enough, no matter how hard I tried. And yet, in that moment, I felt stronger than I ever had. I had said my piece. I had made it clear that I wouldn't be the scapegoat anymore. But what happened next was the part one didn't expect. As I stood there, waiting for them to respond, my mom's voice broke the silence, trembling slightly. You're being cruel. Those words hung in the air, cutting deep. I had expected anger, maybe even more pleading. But not this. Not the accusation of cruelty. I could feel my chest tightening, unsure of how to react. Had I crossed a line? Was I really being cruel for standing up for myself? The tension in the room grew unbearable as I stared at my parents, both silent, waiting for me to say something, anything. But I didn't know what to say next. The guilt started to creep in, but at the same time, there was a fire inside me telling me not to back down. The conflict was building to a breaking point, and I had no idea how far this would go. Would they understand? Or had I finally pushed them too far? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, and just when I thought we had reached an impasse, my dad's voice cut through the tension. "We've always tried to give you everything, you know," he said quietly, his tone edged with frustration. "We've tried to help you, but nothing ever seems to be enough. Do you remember when we paid for your college? All those times we supported you financially when you were struggling? How dare you turn your back on your sister when she needs you most?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart began to race as the guilt and anger mixed together in a whirlwind. I hadn't expected this. I had always known there was an unspoken expectation that I owed them something, but hearing it laid out so plainly, so coldly, made me feel like I was trapped in a game I didn't even know I was playing. But before I could respond, my mom added something that made my stomach drop. "You want to know why we've always treated Sarah like the golden child? It's because she's the one who needed the most help. You never did. You were always the strong one, the one who could take care of herself. We didn't have to worry about you like we had to worry about Sarah." The weight of her words crashed over me like a tidal wave. So, that's it. All these years, they had never really seen me. They didn't understand the struggles I had been through because I didn't show them. They had always placed their focus on Sarah, the one who seemed to need constant guidance and rescuing, while I had been left to handle my own mess. And now, when it was Sarah who was finally in trouble, they expected me to drop everything and play the part of the savior. "Don't you see what you're doing?" I said, trying to steady my voice, even though my insides were churning. "You're using me as a safety net because it's convenient for you. You never gave me the same kind of support you gave her, and now that things have gone south for her, you want me to fix it all over again." My dad's face grew darker, and I could see that he was getting more agitated, but then, in a shocking turn of events, Sarah's voice echoed from the doorway. She had been standing there, listening to everything, and I hadn't even noticed her come in. She looked different, her usual confidence was gone, replaced with a sense of vulnerability I'd never seen before. "I didn't come here to make excuses," she said, her voice unsteady. "But you're right. I've always been the one who needed saving. And I thought that was normal. But now, I'm looking at the wreckage of my life, and I realize something I've never wanted to admit before: I messed up. No one else made my choices for me." The room was dead silent as we all processed her words. This was the first time Sarah had ever taken responsibility for anything. For the first time, she wasn't looking for someone to pick up the pieces for her. The change in her tone, the raw honesty, took me by surprise, and for a brief moment, I wondered if this was the beginning of her real turning point. But then, without warning, she dropped the bombshell I never saw coming. "I don't need help from either of you," she said, her eyes fixed on our parents. "I'll figure it out on my own." I stood there, stunned. The room seemed to spin as the realization hit me hard: Sarah wasn't the same person she had been. But as she turned away and walked out, leaving the conversation hanging in the air, I was left with a deep uncertainty. Had she really changed? Or was this just another act, another way to avoid facing the reality of what she'd done? And what did it mean for me now? For the first time in years, I felt like I didn't know where I stood. Was I supposed to save her after all? Or was this the moment I needed to let go of everything, even my family, and step into a future where I wasn't tied down by their expectations anymore? The stakes had never been higher, and I had no idea how this was going to end. The air was thick with tension as Sarah walked out, leaving my parents and me standing in the wreckage of what had just been revealed. For the first time, I wasn't sure where I stood in this family. I had spent my life waiting for them to see me, waiting for them to notice my struggles. But right now, it felt like I was invisible again, caught between two forces, one that expected me to pick up the pieces and one that was falling apart, leaving me in the dust. For a moment, my parents said nothing. The silence was suffocating. I could feel the pressure mounting, a storm brewing, but I wasn't ready to fold. I had spent too long being the one who was expected to sacrifice everything. I didn't know what the next step would be, but I wasn't going to make the same mistake again. Finally, my mom spoke. "Do you see what you've done?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "She's finally trying to take responsibility, and you pushed her away. We've always asked for your help, and you've always been so distant, so independent. But we're your family." The words hit hard, but they didn't have the same weight they used to. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty for standing up for myself. I wasn't the same person who had bent to their every request, silencing my own feelings. I was tired of being their backup, their second choice. I had spent years trying to make them proud, but I realized I had to live my own life now, without their approval. I'm not going to be your safety net anymore, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. And I'm not going to fix Sarah's mess either. She's right about one thing, she made her own choices, just like I did. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we all learned how to deal with the consequences of our actions. The room went silent again, and I could see the shock in their faces. They weren't used to me standing my ground. But this time, something in me had snapped. I wasn't going to let them guilt-trip me into fixing everything. For once, I was putting myself first. Just as I thought I had made my final point, the door opened again, and Sarah stepped back in. She looked different, more determined, yet there was a hint of vulnerability that I hadn't seen before. She walked toward me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was the older, wiser sibling with all the answers. She was standing there, her own future in her hands, and it hit me, maybe she had actually changed. I'm sorry, she said quietly, looking at me. I've been so caught up in thinking you owed me something, that I forgot to think about how you felt. I've been using everyone, and I've been running from my mistakes for too long. I blinked in surprise. Was this the same Sarah who had always expected everyone else to bail her out? I stood there, speechless, as she continued. I don't want you to fix me anymore. I'm going to get a job, figure this out on my own. But I need you to understand that I will change. I just don't know how long it will take. In that moment, I felt something shift, something I hadn't expected, hope. Maybe Sarah was finally starting to see the reality of her situation. Maybe she wasn't the same person anymore. But the real twist came when she handed me an envelope. I'm not asking for money or a handout, she said, her voice steady. But I know I've taken so much from you in the past. I want to repay you. It's not much, but it's a start. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a check. It wasn't for a huge amount, but it was enough to pay off some of my overdue bills, something I never thought I'd see from Sarah. The same sister who had never once considered my struggles was now trying to make things right. The room felt still as I looked at the check, at Sarah, at my parents. There was an unspoken understanding between us all now. For the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were finally starting to see each other for who we truly were. I had been the family disappointment for so long, but in that moment, I realized I had never truly disappointed myself. The door closed behind Sarah as she left again, but the weight in my chest lightened just a little. I wasn't sure where things would go from here, but for the first time, I wasn't trapped in my role as the fixer. I was free to live my life. And as I watched my parents leave, I knew they had learned something, too, that sometimes, you have to let people figure things out on their own, even if it means stepping back. Maybe the family dynamics had shifted for good. Maybe we would all learn to find our own way. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to carry their burdens anymore. And neither was Sarah. The weeks that followed felt like a breath of fresh air. I didn't know how long the changes would last, but something had shifted, not just within Sarah, but within all of us. The tension that had plagued our family for so long seemed to ease, even if just a little. Sarah got a part-time job at a local cafe, and while it wasn't the dream career she had hoped for, it was a step. She stopped asking for help, stopped leaning on everyone around her to clean up the messes she'd created. I could see her trying, and for the first time, I felt proud of her, not because she was perfect, but because she was taking responsibility. As for my parents, the dynamic between us was different. They had always been the ones holding the strings, expecting me to fall in line, to do what they wanted. But now, they were learning to give me space. They didn't try to guilt-trip me anymore or make me feel like I owed them something. For the first time in my life, I felt like an equal, not a disappointment. But the biggest change happened within me. I stopped looking for approval from my family. I realized that no matter how hard I tried to meet their expectations, it wasn't enough because the problem wasn't me, it was the way our family had always worked. The roles we played, the labels we wore, had held us all back. I wasn't the fixer anymore. I wasn't the responsible one who had to sacrifice my own happiness for others. I had found my voice, and for the first time, I was living for me, not for anyone else. One evening, as I was sitting on my balcony with a glass of wine, reflecting on everything that had happened, I got a text from Sarah. It was simple, just a message that said, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it." That was all I needed. I didn't need grand gestures or apologies. We were both learning, both growing, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were finally moving forward together on our own terms. This story isn't just about family drama or sibling rivalry. It's about finding your own strength, setting boundaries, and learning to take care of yourself before you try to save everyone else. In the end, we all have to face our own struggles, but it's how we deal with them that defines who we are. I finally realized that I wasn't the family disappointment. I was the one who had been waiting for the chance to live on my own terms, and now, I was finally free.